Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Latino Survey Public Opinion Forum. Thanks for being here. We're going to wait 1 or 2 minutes to have some folks join. So if you can hang on for a couple of minutes, we'll be starting shortly. All right, let's get started. Um, Thanks again for joining us. I hope everyone enjoyed a wonderful Halloween. Um, We are here today to talk about Hispanics and political voters and the views of Hispanics in the election. We all know this has been a very interesting election. It's going to be a tight race. There's a lot of interest across the board regarding voters, and we're always interested in what does the Hispanic voting population think. So welcome again. Thanks for being here. This is the last of multiple studies that have been done with the Latino Public Opinion Forum focused on Hispanic voters. Next slide. So this poll that was finished is powered again by the Latino Public Opinion Forum, and it's really a collaborative effort across multiple organizations within FIU, the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy, the Adam Smith Center for Economic Freedom, the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center, the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs, and of course, it's supported by us here at Adsmovil. Next slide. So my name is Maria Twina. I'm the CMO of Adsmovil, and I'm honored to share this virtual stage with the very esteemed Dr. Eduardo Gamarra, who's a professor at FIU, as well as the founding director of the Latino Public Opinion Forum. Thanks for being here, Dr. Gamarra.
Thank you.
So a couple of words about Adsmovil for those who are new to Adsmovil. We are a trusted Hispanic first digital media company, super serving the multi-generational Hispanic cohort across screens and platforms. The Hispanic first piece of this is really important to us because Hispanics have always been our core consumer, and our employees are all Hispanic, and we reflect all countries of origin at acculturation levels. Our publishers are primarily Hispanic as well. While we started as a mobile company, we're now a digital media company with solutions that extend outside of mobile devices, but that still support our mobile Hispanic consumer. And outside of our capabilities, we also offer brands, advertisers, precise targeting and custom opportunities. Next slide. So again, we super serve the multi-generational Hispanic cohort. We've been around for over a dozen years with over 2,500 premium publishers in our ecosystem. We reach 65% of the total digital multi-generational Hispanic population via our omni-channel solutions. And of course, we're minority owned and certified. Our data strategy is pretty sophisticated and leverages key second and third party data providers to hyper target our consumers. And our solution suite ranges from social influencers and sponsorships to our CTV offering Nuestra TV, to our digital out of home solutions, engaging consumers at organic touch points. And our commitment to this sacred earth we call home is evidenced by our partnerships and investment strategy. We work very closely with Saving the Amazon as well. So enough about us. Let's turn this over to our political star today, Dr. Gamarra, so he can share his research findings.
Great. Thank you. Let me just leave it there for a minute. Thank you so much, Maria. I'm delighted to be here again. And as usual, I'm very thankful to both my home institution and the numerous different organizations within FIU that support this. But I'm also very proud of this relationship that we've developed with Adsmovil, which now goes back to the 2016 elections. And we've been doing various kinds of polling over the years with Adsmovil, and this is the most recent take. So Adsmovil has been a wonderful partner to us at FIU. So let me begin basically by looking at this survey. This is a different survey than the ones we've the national samples that we normally do. This is a very targeted sample. We've polled basically in Florida with a large oversample, Texas and California, to sort of group the largest Hispanic population. But then we've done something relatively new for us, which was to poll Hispanics in the 7 swing states. The total sample is 1,600 and a little bit over. Margin of error 3.1% at the 95% confidence interval, right? And we, of course, have also weighted the sample. The national sample is weighted by both gender and by location. And the other samples are primarily weighted by gender. You'll see a little bit later why weighting by gender is important to us. Okay, so I'll be glad to answer any methodological questions that you have. So let me begin, at the very outset, because I know that this is frankly what you're most interested in is, what is the Latino vote these days, right? And what we find, right, is that across our 3 samples, it's very interesting. Latinos at the national level, 56%, almost 57%, would say that they will vote for Kamala Harris. In the swing states, it's 56.8, so it's roughly about the same. Only in Florida do we see a very significant, a different number of 49%. Now, if you look at this, right, by our samples, you can see perhaps the importance of other groups, those who won't vote, Jill Stein, and so on, and don't know. So you have a very interesting number who are still somewhat undecided at this stage. This sample, by the way, we closed last Sunday, so it's a fairly new sample, and you'll see that much of this, of course, is a reflection of the last days of a campaign where things are still very, very much up in the air, and it's very difficult to predict an outcome, and especially to predict an outcome solely on the basis of the Latino vote, right? Now, if you look at the swing states, right, these are the swing states that we covered, right? We did not include North Carolina. But if you look at these swing states, what you find here is a rather interesting situation, right? That across the swing states, the average, of course, except for Georgia, right, is in the 56 to 57% range. This tells you how, in some measure, this is a solid Democratic vote. But if you compare it to 2020, then you have a significant difference in terms of the Latino vote, which used to be, if you go back even further to the Obama years, of almost 70% of Hispanics voting for the Democratic candidate. Today you see this very low margin. Okay, and then in Florida, of course, this is the situation with a Florida voter. All right, I should add something important here that. In our earlier samples in July, for example, at the moment in which President Biden stepped down, before he stepped down, when we asked the question for whom would you vote, only 41% told us that they would vote for President Biden, and about 35% for former President Trump. So that margin was very close among Hispanic voters. The difference today, of course, is that Kamala Harris has recovered some of the ground, but she hasn't recovered all of the ground with Hispanic voters. So that's an interesting observation to make at the outset. Now, We think that there is a gender gap among Hispanics that's quite noteworthy, and this gender gap makes it interesting to observe. And you'll see none of this totals. I mean, the whole thing will total 100%, but these do not total 100% simply because this is this on the left, for example. These are the number of Hispanics who say, who identify with. So 54% of women of males identify with Kamala Harris, pardon me, with Donald Trump, and 60.4% of females identify with Kamala Harris. So you see across this graph how significant the gender gap is, right? And you can see it across the states, right? But not so much in Florida. Florida, it's much closer. The gender gap is not as pronounced. Okay. Now, having said that, this is a very highly motivated group. Now, this, of course, is interesting because you assume that motivation leads to people to vote. This is a sample of people who are likely to vote. Registered voters likely to vote, meaning that they are also American citizens, right? Now, so how motivated are you to vote? Look at the figures. They're very high motivation to vote. Does this necessarily translate into people actually turning out to vote? One thing is what they tell you in the survey, and quite a different thing when you see them. As most of you know, the voter turnout among Hispanics has not really been high historically, right? Averages below 50%, right? Although it's climbed from the 1980s, right, where it was in the 30 to 40% to today in 2020 at about 54%. So we're not, we're assuming that this election, it should have a higher than normal voter turnout. And at least in my view, the results will largely depend on how significant Hispanic voter turnout is. Even if it reaches the 54% that it reached in 2020, that will be a significant turnout, and particularly in swing states. Now, again, if you look at it in every one of the states, the motivation to vote is very high. Okay, and in Florida as well. Now, so let's focus then on what appears to be driving this vote. The principal issues are largely there's three of them that we've seen in this round. Inflation, jobs, and the economy, right, is really where the brunt, the focus is. This is the aggregate number of inflation plus jobs in the economy. And then abortion, right? And abortion, it's interesting that it comes up as one of the principal issues that Hispanics are addressing. And so when you think about it, this is the national figure, right? You see, again, abortion is the third right after. And look, immigration is not that high in terms of concern. It's at 9%. Same thing in the swing states, right? And the same thing in Florida. So we found that to be quite interesting, that abortion would be up there. In comparison, for example, to previous samples, abortion wasn't above immigration and so on. Now, the issue now is to one of the main concerns that we have historically had, of course, and this has been largely an issue of that many people have been concerned about, was, we've sort of thought that there has been this dramatic shift of Democrats over to the Republican Party. And what we found, is really quite interesting, because when you look at the broad identification, right, this is answering this question. What we find, again, is, that the U.S. Latinos at about 48%, swing state Latinos also in that range. Florida Latinos and their identification with the Democratic Party has been dropping considerably, right? Such that, in the general population in Florida, there are over 1 million more Republicans than there are Democrats. But still in Florida, okay, there are more Hispanics who say they are Democrats than who say they are Republicans. The one outlier, of course, is Miami-Dade County, which kind of shoots that in the direction that this is, right? It's important to see this party identification. So now, if you look at this, then we say, all right, which party best represents your interests, right? And if you see this, even in Florida, Latinos believe that the Democrats best represent their particular values, right? Very high, I would say, in the swing states and nationally, not as high in Florida. But so here's the question: have you changed parties in the last year? This is simply the percentage of those who say they have changed parties, right? And so what we've seen, and this now is the third iteration of this question, in which we see about that percentage, right? Roughly between 15, I think we had 19% in the December survey of last year. So that's a again, if you think about 15% of 36 million voters, right, then that's a significant number of people who say that they have switched parties. So we've asked, of course, how, and this is of course in the swing states, right? So again, it varies, right? Much less in some states, much higher in Nevada, for example, and in Pennsylvania, but. Overall, I guess most people don't switch parties, but there's a significant component who does. So how have they switched? It was the important thing to observe. And here you see, right, that of those who say they've switched parties in the national sample, 30% tells us they went from Democratic to Republican, right, and 25% in the swing states. And in Florida, the largest number of 42.3, right? Okay. So when you look at this in the swing states, there you see an interesting component, right? How in Arizona, 21% say they switched from Democrat to Republican. In Wisconsin, 22%. In Pennsylvania, 35%, right? So again, this is of that 15%, right? So a significant number. The other thing to observe there is the move toward independent, and I don't have the in the broader data set, which we'll make available. You'll see the crosstabs by age, and what we are seeing, interestingly, is that among young people are moving away from traditional parties and identifying more with the general, with independence or non-party affiliation. Okay. Now, why did the change, right? There's a whole series of reasons here, but probably you can read as well as I can here, and so you'll see that most say, I believe the new party aligns better with my values, was the number one issue in Arizona. It's the number one issue in Nevada, et cetera. So this among that 15% claims that values were the reason why they switched. Okay. All right, so putting this into perspective, then let's look at, is the US headed in the right or the wrong direction? And here's where we begin to see a little bit of that cognitive dissonance that I've been talking about, right? While they will vote for Kamala Harris, the majority, right, and where there's that 30% or so that won't, right? Most don't believe that the US is headed in the right direction. Now, this is, by the way, significantly less than what we found in earlier iterations of the survey. Just in July, it was 59% who believed that the US was headed in the wrong direction. Okay. Now, and this goes the same for the state of the economy. What is the current state of the economy? Most believe that the economy is doing fair or poor, right? Really a relatively small third believes that the economy is either good or excellent. Again, this is somewhat of a cognitive dissonance, right? Now, having said that, right, then when we look at this nationally, when we look at it in swing states, this holds consistently in all, right? And certainly it holds the same in Florida, right? So, all right. Now, so let's go beyond this. The economy is the clear issue upon which people will vote, right? Or say that they are going to vote, right? But there's this dissonance there, right? Between those who think that the economy is doing poorly, but they're also telling us that the majority is telling us that they'll vote for Kamala Harris. On immigration, right? we basically tried to test some of the messaging that's out there, and one of them is this. This only graphs the strongly agree, right, and agree. And so here you have an interesting result, right? That 36% of US Latinos agree with this idea that the best solution to immigration is to have a large scale raid and to deport them massively, right? In the swing states, it's 31.8, and in Florida Latinos, it's 36.1. Well, one way of looking at this is to say, well, that's the Republican base. Those are the supporters of Donald Trump. That is correct. But at the same time, right? Uh, uh, we think that this is transcending into other groups as well. When you get to see the crosstabs, you'll see, right? And when you look at this in terms of the swing states, again, it's really kind of interesting, right? That across the swing states, you have some interesting levels. In Arizona, for example, there's not as high an agreement with the statement as we would have supposed, given that immigration appears to be more salient there. But and of course, in Florida, it is really a very Florida is in some measure a border state, but among Florida Latinos, it seems like that is a key issue, right? So then there's this question, right, about undocumented immigrants are primarily criminals, right? Largely a perception that has been accentuated by the way in which the campaign has been framed, at least by one of the parties, right? And so again, if you look at this, right, what we're surprised, at least I'm surprised by, is the 40%, nearly 40% there who agrees with this statement, right? The need to build a wall, it's this idea of border security and so on, right? But when you put this together with this idea that most are primarily criminals, right, then this becomes kind of an interesting finding, right? So again, the cognitive dissonance that I've been talking about, right? And again, the same thing throughout the swing states. You see again, a strong agree and agree largely takes the cake, right? Okay, now let me move very quickly here to the third theme, which is abortion, right? And abortion tells you something quite interesting, right? And what we tried to do is we basically tested these 5 ideas, right? We went from a total ban with no exceptions, right? That's the one side, to allowing abortion at any time during pregnancy if the mother's life was at risk, right? And so we were trying to again gauge levels of support, and this of course is only strongly support and somewhat support. And you can see this, of course, right? That again, you can perhaps look at this in terms of the strong Republican support for a total ban, right? Versus the more centered approach, of allowing abortion at any time if the mother's health is at risk. But really, I would argue that most of what we're seeing is this support for right smack in the middle of this table, right? That most people don't want unlimited access to abortion, but want some kind of restrictions. And of course, the reason, I mean, we think that this has a very significant impact in terms of the gender gap, right? Which in the broader study, you'll be able to see those crosstabs. But we also think, it's very interesting in terms of how we're going to probably see some significant cross voting here, right? And maybe in an extreme case, in the case of Florida, where there's an amendment, right? That Amendment 4, which has 60% support in our survey, roughly, right, among Hispanics. And where the gender gap is very obvious. Men are not as supportive of Amendment 4 as women are, but overall, that amendment largely measures the ban on abortion after 26 weeks of pregnancy. So in a sense, then what we're looking at is how these 3 issues, right? The economy, basically abortion, right, are going to have such a strong impact on the outcome of the vote next week, right? And again, here's the breakdown by the swing states, right? In this case, I have graphed North Carolina, and you can see it, right? So, all right. Now, and here's the all of these. Okay, I'm going to try to end so we can have a conversation. Okay. All right. Okay. So let me end there, and but let me just go to one final graph, if I may. Just give me one little bit of time here so I can. Okay, so we want to go to a conversation about Hispanics more specifically, and look at your main source of news about politics, right? And and so in the context of politics, of course, what we've just seen is, where do Hispanics get their information? And we're seeing, of course, internet broadly described, and social media is really important. And of course, traditional television is still relevant, but clearly Hispanics are getting their news from the internet and from social media, and that says a lot, right? Uh, Hispanics in general prefer to consume media, right? That focuses on issues related to the Hispanic community. We see this right. It's not a very high always, or a very high often, but it's really an interesting, almost 40% there, which says that they prefer to consume issues related to the Hispanic community, right? Now, um, we noted that Hispanics still like television, but not that much, right? And then when you look at which are the stations that they're watching, this is an interesting graph. It's still CNN and Fox, and the Hispanic stations seem to be fairly low. Why is that? I guess is well, we'll get to that in a moment. Which are the platforms that they're following? Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, or X, right? And of course, the growing use of WhatsApp among Latinos. And if when we cross tab this with Florida, for example, Florida Latinos overuse WhatsApp. Okay, and and so this is the interesting thing in terms of trust, right? How much do you trust these outlets, right? These platforms? It's not very high, right? So, but it seems that they trust them more than traditional media, and this is really interesting. There's a lot of literature on that as well, right? That it seems that people trust what their relatives send them more than what they hear on national platforms, right? Okay, so there's one more observation on the trust issue that I'd like to address. And by the way, one more thing, which it's in the broader packet, but Hispanics still these Hispanics that we polled prefer their news to obtain their news in English, or in English and Spanish, right? English is number one, and this sort of reflects, right, these patterns of acculturation that we have. Second, third generations prefer to read news in English. They'll be bilingual. They'll read some in Spanish, but they prefer English. But what we are seeing, and especially in terms of for example, the impact of some of the disinformation, that those who prefer language, prefer to consume news in Spanish, are much more susceptible to disinformation than are those who consume language in English. And this is something that we've been looking at specifically in our work, and others have too. So let me conclude this by looking at celebrity endorsements. Okay, and here's where it becomes fascinating, because we didn't exactly plan this way. We didn't know that Bad Bunny was going to become so significant in the final weeks, but we asked this question sort of in the context of Taylor Swift, and sort of wondering, right, if celebrity endorsements were significant with the Hispanic community. And so here what you can see is quite interesting, right? That almost 20% says that that it will motivate them to vote for Kamala Harris, right? Uh, Now, I guess every little bit helps, right? If you're trying to win an election, so it looks like Bad Bunny is not as popular as Taylor Swift overall, but their endorsement is probably important in the grand total of trying to accumulate as many votes as possible. So and here you see the same thing. Even in the swing states, Bad Bunny has a following, right? So among Hispanics, of course. So there we go. Thank you so much. I will be glad to take questions now if you have any. I don't know, Maria.
Uh, Thank you so much, Eduardo. Wow, this is so informative, so interesting. Thank you for this great review here. I've got a couple of questions I'd like to ask. Especially based on what we're seeing with celebrity endorsements and the recent event with the MAGA event and the the comments the comedian made about Puerto Ricans, etc. How much damage has that done to Trump in this last phase of the election? Will it matter? Will it not matter? We saw Bad Bunny and Jennifer Lopez came out today as well, and basically a Latino coalition of celebrities saying it's all Latinos, not just Puerto Ricans. Any thoughts on what impact that will have on maybe voter turnout?
Right. Well, as our survey shows, we're this sample told us 20% of the sample told us that it will motivate them to vote for Kamala, right? And that I think is, again, as I said, it 20% in a very, very tight election may make a difference. But we won't be able to gauge that very, very, scientifically until after the vote is done and whether we can, whether that question, whether we could ask it in an exit poll, right? Did you vote for Kamala because of the incident?
Right.
Right. But what we are seeing is something really interesting, Maria. I think a lot of people are surprised by things that, despite those comments, um, there are segments of the Puerto Rican community, right? And very important segments of the Hispanic community or Latino community that are absolutely steadfast in their commitment to the Republican Party, that it doesn't matter what they say, right? So the impact in terms of trying to get Republican Hispanics, who might be offended by those comments to switch votes, that's unlikely to happen, right? We saw it just in this week in terms of the leadership of communities, even some Puerto Rican leadership who basically dismissed it, sort of along the lines of what the vice presidential candidate has said. These are jokes, people have to grow up. They're just jokes, etc. Right. So it's not going to move Republicans away from Donald Trump. Um, it will consolidate the Democratic vote, right? And it may have an impact on those who are on the fence. But perhaps what this does is, and I guess it's in terms of national pride, right? And Puerto Ricans are an extraordinarily proud group of people, right? That this may move the person who was not going to vote, right? This may move them to vote. But again, it's pure speculation on my part because it's going to be very difficult to measure that. But the expectation, of course, is that this is really going to consolidate the vote, may impress independents, right, and may get people who weren't going to vote back into the arena.
Yeah, yeah. Interesting. Very interesting. Um, I found it also interesting, uh, Georgia and the movement from Republicans to Democrats. What's driving that in Georgia?
Well, that's an interesting thing, and again, it's a lot of it has to do with the changing demographics of Hispanics in Georgia. It seems to me, uh,
Hmm.
Georgia has received a large influx, right, of voters, of Hispanic voters from other states, right? So, and while it's predominantly Mexicans, you have a large migration of other, including many South Florida Hispanics who have moved into Georgia, moved into the Atlanta area, and have remained, with their Republican connection. So that's one way of explaining that, right? And then the other way of looking at this is, I mean, this is clearly in the context of where we are today and how divided we are, and that polarization has largely been, among Hispanics as well, so that we have this very solid group of Hispanics, right, about 33%, right, who are completely identified with the Republican Party, and especially with former President Trump, right? It doesn't matter what you say, what you do, that identification is very strong. And in Georgia, we seem to be seeing that, and it's also, I think, a product of the fact that Georgia, it's it's still a red state, and context, of course, has a lot of influence in terms of how people see things politically.
Yeah, agreed. Okay. Uh, the the under 30 crowd, right? So I've been reading up on, their climate, the environment, those issues remain very strong for them. How are they leaning here?
Yeah, that's probably one of the more difficult puzzles to figure out, right? Because you sort of assume, historically we've assumed that young people are progressives, right? That they favor these kinds of issues, environmental issues and the like. And therefore one would assume that they would identify more with the Democratic Party, and historically they have, right? But in this cycle, it's quite interesting, and you see it across a variety of crosstabs, and it's very difficult. It seems to me that that age group is moving more towards independence. They're breaking with those traditional party ties, right? They don't they don't fully identify with either side, and what does independence mean? It's either non-party affiliate or other parties, if you will. But and then there you also have to see the gender gap, Maria, which is again something that we really need to begin to study a little bit more, right? The gender gap among younger generations, because it's quite interesting that young men, right, um, seem to young Latinos are open to the Republican Party, and especially to President Trump, right? Now, whether that's old-fashioned machismo, right, or what have you, as many have speculated or not, we don't really know. But it's interesting how among young men in particular, right, uh, they have a much more, how should I put it, favorable view of the Republicans than they do of the Democrats. Not so young women, right? And what appears to be driving young women is, of course, the issue of abortion, right? It's not that they're single issue, but it certainly seems that they are much more liberal than their age counterparts.
It's fascinating to me because as we study these demographics, we know that younger generations are more diverse. So one could argue, well, because they accept diversity in greater numbers, because they are diverse and they are the general market within their age cohort, I just find it fascinating that they would not be supporting a candidate that is multicultural, right? But it goes back to the big love him or hate him. I mean, Trump has an incredible personality and a brand out there that for some reason, and I'm still not clear why Hispanics are so drawn to it. I do think it has to do a little bit with that strong-armed um, position he has in the marketplace, but I'd love to see a study on what are the characteristics that are driving uh, the adoration, if you will.
Yeah. Maria, one of the things that I've been, just if you group the issues, for example, right? If you group all of those issues that are, economy, security, immigration, and so on. Let us say the strong arm kind of, the mano dura, if you would use the Spanish
Yeah,
term.
yeah.
Right?
Hmm.
Those are very Republican issues, right? And those largely attract, right? Those attract Hispanics and attract Hispanics, especially the Republican Hispanics, right? If you look at all the social issues, right, the democratic issues, right, including things like education, healthcare, and so on, those are very democratic issues, and you might put them in terms of this struggle that we've had. This election, in large measure, it's between fear. I won't use the term hate, but primarily, fear and the promise of punishment, right? The mano dura side
Yeah,
versus the hope on the other side, right? I mean, in the end, this is where most elections kind of, they pivot around these two broad things.
sure.
And but it's really interesting because the Republican campaign has, from the very beginning, from the time in which former President Trump launched his campaign the day after January 6th, I guess, right? Until now, it's really been driven by those issues, right? And he hasn't let go. He hasn't done what candidates normally do, which is they run in the primary towards the extremes and then sort of center their position
Yeah,
in the general election. He hasn't done that. The Democrats have done that. The Democrats, because largely it's how Kamala Harris has been portrayed as a communist and so on, right? And so they've moved to the center, but they've managed to keep a coalition. In the end, I think, if you look at these two things, right, the fear and promise of punishment versus you want to call it hope, right, or joy,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
I mean, those are the things that appear to be driving the electorate, and yet and these are just perhaps my personal assessment that in this context, maybe fear and promise of punishment is stronger than hope, right? And that will likely have a very strong impact, and that's why I think even among Democrats, you see this move towards being a lot harsher on immigration than historically the Democratic Party has been.
yeah. And I'd love to get your thoughts on this. How much of fear in that messaging is resonating more because of the fearful world we all live in outside of the US?
Well, we didn't, I mean, foreign policy doesn't come up very high, nationally. It does in places like South Florida, right? Uh, but certainly, and remember, those questions are open questions, so it doesn't come up as top of mind.
Yeah,
But what you are seeing, and maybe in more qualitative research, we are seeing, yes, there's a fear of what's going on around the world, and for some Latinos, not all, because remember, Maria, that the national Latinos, especially with a strong component of Mexicans, right? They're not really driven to vote by how the U.S. stands with respect to Mexico or the Mexican government. And this is a very strong contrast with South American immigrants, right? Or other Caribbean immigrants who really look at
yeah.
who identify, right, with maybe the Republican Party more so because of strong stances with respect to their home countries, right?
Hmm.
So, but it seems to me, again, here's the idea that the Biden administration has been seen more weaker on international issues, right? Whether that's true or not is, of course, subjective, versus this idea that somehow Trump was really tough. And that message has resonated well, right? Now, one of the things that we are seeing, and this is really kind of interesting, is that uh, we're not, at least I've been arguing, right, that the communism messaging that has been so strong from 2018 onward, right, that probably has reached its apex, right? That it's not as effective anymore as it used to be. and that there are these other things that are more important, these issues that we've addressed. So we did measure, for example, you know, and we know we have this whole sequence going back several years, right? When you ask Latinos, right, how they self-identify, right? Uh, there's some who identify on the left, small number, some who identify on the extreme right, small number. The vast majority are square in the middle, right? And what's always surprised us is, you know, these questions about, you know, support for the role of the state and, you know, economic freedom and so on. Hispanics
Mhm.
are very entrepreneurial. They love the free market and so on. So, but at the same time, they love the role of the state in correcting historical grievances, right? But when you ask them, for example, what is your opinion about socialism, right? You know, which in the context of these campaigns, you would assume that most are going to be way over here saying these are very, you know, socialism is terrible and so on. What we find is really interesting. Very few say that socialism is really good, right? A larger number say that socialism is very bad, but the vast majority are smack in the middle. And
Mm,
you can almost superimpose those on the question about what do you think of capitalism, right? A larger number thinks it's good, a small number thinks it's bad, but the vast majority is square in the middle. And
sure.
that's where I think the electorate is.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I have one more question before a final question. If anyone has questions, feel free to include them in the chat. We're happy to ask them. So I was reading this morning um, about the issue of abortion and folks splitting their vote, like voting for uh, Trump, for example, but then at the state level, reflecting their abortion preferences at the state level. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think we're going to see that within the Hispanic market?
We've already seen it. I think it shows up in this survey when we look at support for Amendment 4, right? When you do the
Hmm.
cross,
Hmm.
right? Uh, yes, people are splitting tickets, and so they're, you know, in particularly in Florida, where you have Amendment 4, which is for abortion, and Amendment 3, which is for legalization of marijuana. You're seeing broad bipartisan support for those, which, you know, I think it's still close. I think probably marijuana will pass before abortion, but they're right there on the edge, right? Despite a very strong campaign, even by the governor against Amendment 4, that kind of split is happening. It will likely happen nationally. So in other words, people will vote for abortion, they'll vote for marijuana, but they'll vote for Trump, right? Even though the two parties are on opposite ends there, right?
Right.
The other thing, Maria, which is again, we really can't say this conclusively, but I think that there is such a thing as a hidden Kamala vote, right? In other words, there are probably people who are because of the issues, right? Are voting will vote for Kamala, right? But don't want their vote to be public. Very much the same way we saw this in 2016,
Yes.
who were voting for Trump but would never tell us. Those of us who are going around nosily asking the question, right? So
Yeah.
now, of course, we won't know that until the outcome is measured.
Sure. So, all right, I'm not seeing any more questions. So I have one final question, which you don't have to answer. If you were a betting man, Dr. Gamara, who's going to win this election?
um, Look, I think we all have, you know, I asked that question actually, you know, I asked the question, irrespective of who you are voting, who do you think will win the elections, right? We asked that, we didn't show it here. And among Latinos, and sort of that, you know, that's asking them to kind of be political analysts, and Latinos think that Kamala will win, right? I mean, that it's a combination of who they will vote for and who do they really want to win, right? So um, But look, it is so close, Maria, and if surveys, and there are many, and there are many very good ones, and there are also many bad ones. But if you just look at the very, very good surveying that's going on around the country, that has gone around, it is so close that on hopefully it'll be Wednesday morning, we'll know. But if either candidate wins, I won't be surprised.
Really interesting. Okay. And just for my own um, education, which surveys do you tend to look at that you feel are representative of the populace, correct? That accurately represent the populace.
Yeah, I won't mention specific names, but I think it's an important opportunity to say, the following, and as you know from what Adsmobile does, especially in terms of your the research that you conduct for the company, right? I mean, the reality is that it does matter what the reputation is of the firm, right? There are a lot
Yeah.
of fly-by-night pollsters out there, right? Um, that's number one. Number two, always look at sample size. Hispanics tend to be underrepresented in most polling, most national
Yes.
polling.
Right.
I've seen polls where they'll make these enormous claims about trends with, under 150 Hispanics nationally, right? That, of course, is tells you something. The margin of error on 150 is, 15,
Ugh,
20%. So always look at the sample size, right? Always look at methodology. And particularly because it's so difficult. This was a difficult poll to complete because
sure.
not, the way we used to poll 15, 20 years ago, right, where it was relatively, let's say simple, but it was, you would get relatively good response rates, right? Because you could call landlines. Today, landlines are obsolete, and cell phones are difficult to get to. But we tried to do a combination of that. But we're increasingly going into web-based polling because we have to satisfy the samples. So, for example, the average response rate on telephone surveys is maybe 7%. Okay. This
Mm,
survey has an 18% response rate, which has been quite good. But then we have to actively, right? I mean, we have to make sure that we're hitting the targets that our sample calls for. But it's very difficult to reach those samples. And especially, when you know this, Maria, when, today anybody calls you and they call all day, most of them
all
are,
day.
and nobody wants to pick up a call from pollsters, and especially these days when they're getting inundated by calls.
Yeah, agree, 100%. Well, thank you for that. I think that's great, sound advice on what you actually value when you're looking at these research results. But we're just going to have to hang on to the edge of our seat till next week and see what happens. And hopefully, you are right that Wednesday morning we have a president-elect, and we don't have a lot of issues to determine that. So, thank you, Dr. Gamara. As always, appreciate your time,
Thank
your
you,
your
Maria.
wisdom, and the research you deliver. Thank you so much.